Yes.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Inara Tabashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any question for our guest. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким поклоном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Nara. It's my pleasure to introduce today for our 167th weekly meeting our friend and contributor, Dr. Robert McCollister from Ohio, with his presentation on May 9th. May 9th, the important day in the Soviet history and World War II victory appropriated by Putin's warmongering propaganda. Dr. McCollister has Ph.D. from Ohio State University with a major in international relations, and he has taught a number of courses on national security policy studies and U.S. military and foreign policy at Ohio State, at Shawnee State, Morehead State, and has been a public school teacher and a coach for most of the last 40 years. And he also serves on a Sunflower Seeds nonprofit local group, which helps with the war effort in Ukraine. Thank you, Dr. McCollister, and the microphone is yours. Please talk to us.
Okay. Thank you, Victor. It's great to be back on Ukraine. I haven't spoken for a while. A lot has happened, so it'd be great to try to catch you up. And what I really want to talk about is where I think things are headed in world politics, build on some of the things we talked about before, and talk about what I think, how those trends in world politics will affect Ukraine. Victor, you can go ahead and start the slideshow. We are here on a momentous day. It's been 80 years since the end of World War II. And I think in a lot of people, and we've talked about this before, but we are in the longest period of great power peace since the rise of the nation state in 1648. And that's not an accident. That's not just a happy circumstance. That's because the leaders of the United States and our allies in the Cold War period and following built a better world. I used to like to tell my students that the guys got in those Higgins boats and landed on Utah and Omaha Beach, and they came home and built a better world. And I think that's absolutely true. We began with a picture of the Yalta Conference of FDR and Churchill and Stalin. And there was hope at this period in February 1945 that the World War II alliance could continue and that the three great World War II allies could manage world politics in a more peaceful direction. But those hopes broke down pretty quickly. Even before FDR's death on April the 12th, 1945, arguments had begun over the future of Poland. And the next slide, Victor, shows the Potsdam Conference, which happened in July 1945. By now, it was Truman that was meeting with Stalin and Clement Attlee after the British elections had replaced Winston Churchill. But in many ways, Potsdam was more than the last conference of World War II, was the first of the Cold War because the disagreements had begun to escalate over Eastern Europe. There was still hope in 1946-47 that conflict might be avoided. But as you get into 1948 and the crisis years of 48 and 49, a new world was starting to emerge, the Cold War world. I mean, the Berlin blockade began in May of 1948, ended in June of 1948 and ended in May of 49. In February 1949, the last government Eastern Europe and Czechoslovakia fell under Soviet control. Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb in August 49, and Mao and the communists took over in China in October. And it was really by then that the West had come to conclude, America and its allies came to conclude that they needed to build a new security system. It doesn't happen all at once, but what emerges over time is really something remarkable and unlike anything we've ever seen in world history. And it's a system that's built on two pretty simple pillars: that the Western allies in this confrontation with the Soviet Union would link their security together and link their economies together to stand up to the Soviets. And then following the collapse of the Soviet Union, that system continues to expand, continues to grow and create what my old Ph.D. advisor, Dr. Crusoe, called a zone of peace. And the system's pretty simple to understand. The linked security, and Victor, you can go to the next slide on NATO. The linked security was built around the system of alliances, and NATO is the ultimate example of that because it's the most remarkable alliance in world history. Rather than an old-fashioned alliance where countries just promise to have each other's back in case of war, we linked our security together in remarkable ways. The Secretary General of NATO was always a European. The Supreme Allied Commander in Europe was always an American four-star. But it went deeper than that. If you went to NATO headquarters, there are officers from every country in Europe. It began with 12 countries in 1949. Today, it's 32 countries, encompassing the United States, Canada, and almost all of Europe. And all those officers work together, but they plan together. We train together. When NATO has had the responsibility to use force in the effort against the Houthis and the first Gulf War, you name it, we worked together pretty seamlessly because we trained together all the time. During the Cold War, those forces were stationed very far forward together in West Germany, up against the inter-German border. So it was a remarkable alliance. One other aspect that's really significant for now and the future is facing massive Soviet conventional forces. The United States extended its nuclear umbrella. We adopt this policy of extended deterrence. We told our European allies, if the Soviets attacked using conventional forces or nuclear forces, we would respond with nuclear weapons of our own. As the Soviets began to develop their own nuclear arsenal after 1949 and ballistic missiles to carry them, there were some doubts, particularly among de Gaulle and the French, that we would trade New York for Paris, as he said. So the British in 52 and the French in 1960 developed their own limited nuclear deterrent force. And there actually was in the 1960s an effort and discussions about building a multilateral independent European deterrent. American Paris submarine launch Polaris submarine launch ballistic missiles on European submarines with multilateral European crews. But the more they looked into it, the more difficult to command and control issues got, and it was too complex. And so all the way through the Cold War, all the way up to the present, an extended deterrence from the United States remains a cornerstone of NATO security. There's another aspect, and the second pillar of this system is these countries began to link their economies. This began even before the end of the war. At the Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944, only a month after D-Day, all of the major allies, minus the Soviet Union, since it wasn't a capitalist country, met at Bretton Woods and began to design an economic system where countries link their economies together. See, they had learned from the mistakes that were made after the First World War, when led by the United States, all the countries after World War I, all the major world economies began to erect these huge tariff barriers. And you got a tariff war that caused world trade to dry up through the 1920s. Now, there's still a lot of debate about how the role that tariff war had on the coming of the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 clearly accelerated the Depression, but where there's little debate is that the tariff war of the 1920s helped lead to World War II, particularly in the case of Japan. Because when we began to put up tariff barriers and other countries began to put up tariff barriers, the Japanese felt that we were trying to isolate them. They already saw themselves surrounded with European colonies in China, with us with a colony in the Philippines, with the French in Indochina and the Dutch in Indonesia. They felt isolated. And the Japanese drive for empire, the drive for autarky, self-sufficiency, they felt was a response to that. So it ultimately leads to Pearl Harbor. And the people of Bretton Woods learned from that. They learned from those mistakes, and they began to build a series of institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, most of all GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that every decade, all the way through the mid-1980s, tariff barriers were lowered until by the Reagan years and the Uruguay round of GATT negotiations, tariffs were incredibly low. And the world began to knit itself together through trade. So the system was built on linked economies and on linked security. And by the time you get to, excuse me, I almost jumped ahead. Victor, go ahead to the next slide. The other aspect of linked economies was the development of the EU. Jean Monnet and the fathers of the EU wanted to avoid a third European civil war. And the purpose of what became the EU was always peace. It was not an attempt to take advantage of the United States in terms of trade. It was always about guaranteeing peace on the continent, especially peace between the French and the Germans. And it began slow with the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952-53. All the way later in the decade, it became the European Economic Community, through the European Community, and finally the EU with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. And very simply, the European Union grew larger with more countries, from the original 7 all the way up to 27 today, and they link their economies more comprehensively to the point that by 2000, most of the countries in the EU had a joint currency. So this linkage in this system of security and economics helped create what Dr. Cruzel used to call a zone of peace. And you can go on to the next slide. This is a map from a book by Thomas Barnett called The Pentagon's New Map from, oh gosh, I think the book's about 15 years old now. In the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, America and this system is at the zenith of its power. We talk about the unipolar moment, where the United States now is by far the dominant country in world politics, and the security system dominates, the system of alliances and integrated economies dominates world politics. We had gotten to the point where, well, if you look at this map carefully, we got to the point, notice that dotted line. Everything above and below that dotted line is what Barnett called the functioning core, the part of the world economy that had linked its economy together, and for big chunks of it, its security together, to such a degree that war had largely been taken off the table as a way to solve disputes. That's the way we saw the world in the 1990s and even into the early 2000s. And I would point out that Russia and China, he defines as part of the functioning core. So the 1990s are the height of this American system. But by the early 2000s, you begin to see things fray at the edges and become more serious, and problems begin to develop. First, you get 9/11, and the United States is pulled into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a decade-long war in Iraq, a war that goes on for 2 decades in Afghanistan, and saps for the United States the will on the part of a large number of Americans to be involved in world politics. You also get the economic crisis, the financial crisis, 2008, which caused people to question American economic leadership. It is in this period you see the rise of China, with China in 2001 becoming a member of the WTO. China's economy grows dramatically, and American and other countries' trade deficit with China begins to grow, and that becomes a very difficult problem internally, politically. And the third big event that happens in the 21st century is you get something that we didn't really see coming. You get the rise of these ultra-nationalist, even kind of neo-fascist ideologues around the world. In some ways, the first mover on this, the trailblazer, was Putin himself, who begins to build this ultra-nationalist regime in Russia in the first decade of the 21st century. In some ways, the first really scary moment for folks was his speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he railed against the American system, the expansion of NATO, American intervention in the domestic affairs of countries to promote democracy. That was a real wake-up call for Americans' allies. And it's about this time that you see NATO make its first commitment for countries to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. In the early stages after the end of the collapse of the end of the Cold War, Western European militaries really began to atrophy because, to be honest, they didn't see any security threats. But with Putin then in 2010, you get Viktor Orban elected in Hungary, who espouses much the same kind of ultra-nationalist ideology. Modi in India, very similar kind of ideology. In 2014 is elected. Even Xi Jinping becomes president of China in 2012. And while Xi Jinping is a member of the leader of the Communist Party, the ideology that he's really promoted since 2012 is very nationalist and about the growth of Chinese power. You get Law and Justice taking power in Poland in 2015. And just recently, Prime Minister Meloni from the Brothers of Italy party became prime minister. The Brothers of Italy very, very explicitly draws their historical links back to the Mussolini era in Italy. And in countries all across Europe, parties have not yet come to power that are even more nationalist. Marine Le Pen in France, the AfD in Germany has gotten a lot of attention lately, the League in Italy and Matteo Salvini there, and there are others, Freedom Party in Austria. And these are very far right, very anti-EU nationalist political parties. So the system has frayed. There are challengers now. That map would be different. So you can go on to the next map, the world map. And my question is, where are we headed? And what does that mean for Ukraine? So what seems to happen, what seems to be happening, and I think there are two alternatives. One is some continuation of the system as it is. Sorry, my phone's talking. A continuation of the system as it is. And the other alternative is, and what looks like may be happening, and Steve Bannon has talked about this, is the emergence of a sphere of influence world, of a world dominated by three great powers, the United States, by Russia, and China, with the United States dominating the Western Hemisphere, China in the Far East, and Russia in perhaps Central Asia, but clearly more in Eastern Europe, all having their sphere of influence. It seems, given President Trump's rhetoric, that this is the kind of world he prefers, although that is not clear and things are still in a state of flux. When he talks about retaking the Panama Canal, when he talks about making Canada the 51st state, when he refuses to renounce the use of force to take Greenland from a NATO ally, Denmark, what he seems to be hinting at is the building of an American Western Hemisphere sphere of influence, kind of a Monroe Doctrine on steroids. So I think those are the two possibilities: some continuation of the old system with possible adjustments and changes, or that new, radically different world that Steve Bannon compares to the concert of Europe, where the great powers managed peace in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. So let's take a look. Briefly, we'll look at Asia, but I want to come back to Europe and Ukraine fairly quickly. When you look at Asia, and you can go on, Victor, to the map of Asia that's next. When you look at Asia, a policy that continues where we are now, with potentially with adjustments, what would that look like? Well, if you look at the map of Asia, China's ability to project force is very much limited by the system of alliances that we built after World War II during the Cold War. The alliance system in Asia is different than in Europe. There is no Asian NATO. The alliances we have there are bilateral, not multilateral. We have an alliance with Japan and an alliance with South Korea. We have a traditional alliance relationship with the Philippines, our only ever real colony. Our alliance with Taiwan is a bit more complex. It's not formal anymore. It was until 1979, but when we recognize mainland China as a legitimate government of China, the commitment for America to defend Taiwan has always been more implicit, not explicit, although President Biden went a little further than that. We've always left it open whether we would defend Taiwan from a Chinese attack. But the Chinese always had to honor the Shanghai Communique, which Nixon signed in 1972 on his trip to China, the Beijing summit, which said that we acknowledge that Taiwan was part of China, but the two could not be reunified by force. And there is an implicit threat that the United States would intervene if the Chinese tried to do it by force. And the United States has continuously conducted arms sales and helped Taiwan build its defenses. So what would a continuation of that policy, which would be a continuation of what President Bush did, President Obama did, President Biden did, and the policy of Donald Trump in his first administration. This is clearly the policy they followed in the first administration. What it would do is the United States would be able, working with those allies, be able to confront China in a way that that limited China's ability to bring power, to tell the Chinese, look, all these allies are united in opposing Chinese expansion. And we could go to them from a position of strength and talk about the imbalances, the Chinese economic policies, this emphasis on these exports, that China is going to have to move to a very different trade relationship with the world. Victor, you can go on to the next map, that the Chinese expansion into the South China Sea, what you see here is the 9 dashed line, which the Chinese have basically claimed sovereignty or dominance over everything inside that line. And that has led to a series of conflicts with the Vietnamese over the Paracels, the Filipinos over the Spratlys, a little north in the Sea of Japan, the Senkaku Islands, claimed both by China and Japan. Inside that 9 dash line, the Chinese have been building, turning atolls and reefs into military bases, into air naval bases in the South China Sea. But a united alliance that every president, including President Trump, in the past, has tried to present this united face versus the Chinese, to stand up and to force the Chinese into a stance that would be more acceptable to their neighbors. We could talk about arms control and the Chinese nuclear buildup and a whole series of things, because China's ability to project power is very much limited by those alliances. The second possibility is, and we all know, everybody here is familiar with the fact that the United States has imposed sanctions. During the Cold War, our economic policy and our security policy were two oars rowing in the same direction. Now we have imposed these tariffs on Vietnam, on Japan, on South Korea, on Taiwan, on the Philippines. And so those two policies are in conflict. And the question is, what wins out? We are meeting with the Chinese tomorrow in Switzerland. There is fear in the Far East that ultimately President Trump will make a trade deal with China that throws our allies under the bus, particularly Taiwan. President Trump at times has made statements about how South Korea takes advantage of the United States, Japan takes advantage of the United States, Taiwan stole our chip industry. And there is fear, and this is real fear in Asia, that he might, in the end, pull America back from the Far East to make a deal with China. If that were to happen, then you're in a very different situation. If the Japanese, if the South Koreans, if Taiwan cannot count on the United States in case of Chinese aggression, then they have two choices. They can either join with China, they can bandwagon with China and become allies or at the very least neutral. Then the United States has lost a tremendous amount of influence in Asia, but that's one possibility. It's one way they could go. The other way they could go is try to band together to balance Chinese power, but they're much smaller countries. One of the things I worry about, and these discussions have already begun, is if they can't count on America's extended deterrence, they need nuclear weapons of their own. Already, 70% of people in South Korea favor South Korean development of nuclear weapons, their own independent arsenal. Taiwan, discussions quietly have begun in Taiwan about this possibility. Even in Japan, as unthinkable as that is, because Japan's the only country that's ever had nuclear weapons used on them, even in Japan, that discussion is at least quietly begun, that they might possibly need to build nuclear weapons if the United States withdraws from Asia. Then we go on to Europe, so you can go to the next map, Victor. In Europe, the story's similar. If the United States continues, and now we can start to talk a little bit about Ukraine, if the United States continues, probably with reduced presence, if we pull back some, but we remain committed that, and Europe continues to believe that Article 5, that America's commitment that an attack on one is the same as an attack on all, if they believe that's still viable, and we continue, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe remains an American, alliance planning and all that stuff continues, we maintain our system of extended deterrence. If that happens, then the United States can continue this united front against Russia and Ukraine, and the United States, the alliance with Europe survives. It will probably require already has required increased European defense spending, but it's possible that we can still continue that policy of united front in Europe. The problem is in Europe, with a series of events, Europe has come to doubt America's commitment. Secretary of Defense Hegseth made a speech shortly after the administration took office, and made America's commitment to Europe seem less certain. He has floated the idea that the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe might no longer be an American. He talked about in that speech the possibility of American troop withdrawals, particularly troop withdrawals from the Baltics and from Poland, where troops were sent after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that and other things to talk about in just a second have made Europeans begin to question our commitment to European defense. It has done it to the point now that there's open talk about the development of an independent European nuclear deterrent. President Macron has already talked about this, about stationing French nuclear forces in Germany. Now, the French nuclear forces are much smaller than the Russians. The Russians can deploy over 1,500 nuclear weapons pretty quickly. The French have about 275 nuclear weapons based on aircraft with cruise missiles, and on submarines, the British have about 225 nuclear weapons, all based on Trident submarines, or Trident missiles on British submarines. So there's already preliminary discussion about building some kind of independent deterrent, maybe based on the French and British arsenals. But this is taking place within the context of this growing nationalist movement all across Europe, with the AfD getting 20% of the vote in German elections, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the National Rally and Marine Le Pen in France, with the Romanian nationalist Eurosceptic getting 40% of the vote just last week, in a Romanian election with President Fico in Slovakia, who attended the Victory Day rally in Moscow, with Italy, Matteo Salvini and the League in Italy. Matteo Salvini is deputy prime minister. You can Google his name and you see him standing in Red Square with a t-shirt with Vladimir Putin's picture on it. And already Marine Le Pen and Prime Minister Meloni have basically thrown cold water on the idea of French nuclear weapons being used to defend Europe. And every one of these parties has very close ties to Vladimir Putin. In some way or another, every one of those parties I mentioned has links to Putin. The National Rally got a huge loan from Russian banks in the late teens. The AfD has links to Vladimir Putin. Hungary clearly has links to Vladimir Putin. In fact, the Ukrainians broke up a Hungarian spy ring today. So all this is happening, and at the same time, the Trump administration has expressed, if not a preference, at least some support for those parties. And Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference this year was especially disturbing for the Europeans. They found it especially unsettling, because he criticized the governments of Europe for ostracizing those nationalist parties. And following that speech, he met with the leaders of AfD. That came on the heels of Elon Musk, close ally of President Trump, endorsing AfD in the election. And understand, AfD is a very far-right party, very extremist on a whole range of issues. In fact, the German Domestic Intelligence Service, their FBI, labeled them an extremist party last week and came under pretty serious criticism from Secretary of State Rubio and Vice President Vance. So the forces, the question is, if the United States pulls back in Europe, can Europe stay integrated, create its own defense, and not just in nuclear weapons, but can they do something that's never been done before? 30 European countries form an integrated command structure. This is not with an American hegemon leading the way. This is 30 countries with a history of rivalries, with a history of security concerns, and a long, bloody period of war since the rise of the nation state in Europe. Can they put those aside and build an integrated security system, a command and control structure, a division of labor, all the things you need to build a credible security force in Europe? That would be a very difficult task. If Europe were to splinter, if the EU no longer continues to integrate, even you start to get, if these nationalist parties start to win more and more elections, if you start to get a dissolution of the EU or a weakening of the EU, then security cooperation will be even more difficult. So those are two possibilities there. I'm not sure which is most likely, but a continued American commitment to the defense of Europe or something different. A European security system on its own without the United States, or worse, a collapse of the EU and NATO. Those are all possibilities. And if that were to happen, you would find, especially if the security cooperation in Europe really starts to collapse, then there'll be even more pressure for countries like Poland to develop nuclear weapons. Potentially even Germany develop nuclear weapons, to have their own independent deterrent. So finally, what's this mean for Ukraine? Well, there's a lot happening right now, obviously. In the short term, there is talk. President Trump talked about a 30-day ceasefire, tried to pressure the two sides into a 30-day ceasefire where negotiations continue for a longer-term agreement. Putin has clearly overplayed his hand recently. What I guess you call the Witkoff plan that was floated a few weeks ago was something Putin should have absolutely agreed to because it was so favorable, granting Russia sovereignty over Crimea and control over the areas it's taken in the east and the Donbass. Those would have been very difficult, particularly the Crimean part, for the Ukrainians to swallow. In fact, it's really unconstitutional. No Ukrainian political leader could agree to ceding sovereignty over Crimea. But Putin didn't do that. He didn't jump on that. That was a mistake. Zelensky's been a little more adept. His meeting with President Trump in the Vatican went pretty well. They signed the minerals deal. So Putin's a little on a back foot right now. And yes, the United States, we talked about this prior to going on the air, the United States has allowed other countries from Israel and places to transfer Patriot missiles to Ukraine. That's a very, very important development. And very, very pleased to see that happen. So there's going to be back and forth. What both sides are going to try to do, what's really important for both Zelensky and Putin to do, is to make the other side look like the obstacle to peace, so that Trump blames their opponent for blocking a peace deal. The mineral deal was a big step in Ukraine's favor, and it's a much more favorable deal than the one that was initially offered. This deal is actually not bad. It actually can help Ukraine build. So there have been some positive developments on the Ukrainian side. We'll see what Putin does. Putin needs the sanctions lifted. Russia's economy has real problems, and he needs sanctions relief. So he needs to convince Trump that Ukraine is the obstacle. So if this continues, if the United States and the NATO alliance continue, so in that scenario where we remain an active part of NATO, maybe with a reduced presence and more European spending on defense, if the US and NATO allies continue to support Ukraine, even if the United States is not sending massive amounts of material, but Europe steps up its aid, and we keep the sanctions in place, and that's critical, we keep the sanctions in place, that could pressure Russia as the war goes on, because Russian losses are horrific. I don't honestly think time is on Russia's side. Ultimately, people have always said that, but I don't think it is. I think the Russian economy is in more trouble than people realize. If we continue to support the Ukrainians and the U.S. remains engaged with NATO, then Russia might be forced to talk more seriously about a peace agreement. And I'm running low on time. I don't want to go too long, but what would its structure look like? There have been three possibilities. Lawrence Friedman's talked about this. Three possibilities in Ukraine. Ukraine needs a security force if the war ends to keep the war from resuming. And think about two historical examples, Vietnam and Korea. One peace that lasted, one that didn't. Why did South Vietnam collapse? Well, it was because there were fatal flaws in the agreement that was signed in Paris in January 1973. There are a whole series of things, and I don't want to go into in depth, but South Vietnamese security was not fully taken care of. North Vietnamese troops are allowed to stay on isolated bases in South Vietnam. American aid began to wither a bit. And when the North Vietnamese launched their offensive in March 1975, on April 30th, within just weeks, a month or so, South Vietnam collapsed. We don't want to see that. The better example is Korea, where peace has lasted now since July 27th, 1953. So what are the possibilities that Friedman talked about? One is a peacekeeping force, probably a United Nations force. Zelensky will never agree to that. United Nations peacekeeping forces typically are not able to keep the peace in a conflict where the two sides are determined to continue to fight. They're small, they're not particularly strong, ineffective. Zelensky will never agree to that. The second possibility Friedman talked about is a tripwire force. 40, 50,000 European troops. President Trump has made it clear American troops would not be there. 40 to 50,000 troops, a substantial force, 3-4 divisions, air power, that if the Russians were to try to resume the attack, could do real damage to a Russian assault and buy enough time for Europe to mobilize and bring even more forces. The problem is that would require American intervention. Much of the logistical strength of NATO is possessed by the United States. So if you're going to move troops into a conflict zone and move them quickly, we're going to have to help. That was in NATO's division of labor, one of the things we specialized in. We're an ocean away from every war we take part in. We have to be really good at logistics. That would require American help. I doubt Putin would ever agree to anything like that unless he was in dire circumstances. And I'm not sure how much the Trump administration would want to back up an agreement like that. And the third thing would be a real deterrent force, a force of 130, 150,000 troops on the ground in Ukraine, air, land power, that could defeat a Russian attack if it came more along the Korean model. The problem is the Europeans would have trouble mustering that anytime soon. Putin would never agree to that. So the exact nature of in this continuation scenario where the United States continues in its role in NATO, it's still unclear how the war ultimately ends. And I think at least for the time being, the war is going to go on. In the other circumstance, where the United States withdraws from Europe, withdraws from NATO, or if we don't withdraw formally, but no one really believes that Article 5 commitment is valid. If they don't believe that we would come to the defense of, say, the Baltics, if the Russians tried to link up Russia to Kaliningrad, north of Poland, through that Slovakia corridor. If the Europeans don't believe we will come to the defense of the Baltics or to Poland, then you're in a different situation for Ukraine. If Europe stays united and the European security system holds after an American withdrawal or an American dramatic pullback, then Ukraine is in a much better position. The survival of European integration is incredibly important for Ukraine. If Europe were to splinter, Ukraine is in much greater danger. A Europe that stays together, Ukraine can join the EU, maybe even someday join NATO. That would be a difficult thing to do, I think, with the Trump administration. But in a scenario where the United States pulls back, it's a possibility, but they can at least join the EU, and Europe can remain determined to help protect Ukrainian sovereignty. In a scenario where Europe splinters, Ukraine is in a much more dangerous position and much more vulnerable to Russian aggression. And in that situation, Ukraine will have to think clearly about developing nuclear weapons. They clearly have the capability of nuclear power stations. They have spent fuel, which contains plutonium, which they can reprocess and turn into nuclear weapons. They've developed delivery systems. Ballistic missiles are actually designed in bureaus in Ukraine during the Cold War. So that's a possibility. One of the things as a person who studied nuclear proliferation is I'm very worried about if the United States begins this pullback, which is a possibility. I don't think it's predetermined. I think we are in a state of flux and we do not know where the Trump administration is going to go. I know that Steve Bannon and others have said, but I think it's still not determined yet. I do think we could be entering an era of pretty dramatic increase in the number of countries that have nuclear weapons. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCollister. It was a fascinating historical excursion. And Dr. Deutsch, please.
Bob, Russia has stepped up its bombings through drone attacks on civilian areas, missiles. What air defense system does Ukraine have now, and what are the prospects of it getting a more effective air defense system?
What a lot of people speculate is the Russians are trying to do. The Russians have calculated that we're not sending any more Patriots, in particular, any what's called the National Air Surface Missile Systems and others. That's particularly an area where the United States American aid is critical. And what the stepped up Russian attacks, the purpose of them is to deplete that inventory, believing that more is not coming, which is why it was very, very heartening to see that a couple of countries were able to transfer Patriot systems to the Ukrainians, that we gave them permission to do that. That's the kind of capability that really only the United States can provide in any real numbers. And that's where American aid is most important. The Europeans can provide a lot of stuff, and they can provide some of those systems, but most of those systems are actually American. And it's very important that we continue to provide that kind of aid.
I hope so. Thank you.
Yeah.
Here's more questions. I can add some comments on my own, but I would like a discussion because it's today that Red Square Parade was going on for the first time, showing us the real alliance of China with Russia. Katerina, please.
Not a question, just a reaction. And first of all, thank you. Taking us through those maps was incredibly helpful. And I am definitely going to share the recording of this podcast with some students, because thank you for laying it out from the very beginning of explaining why we had that piece and explaining that we linked not just our security, our economy together. I mean, it makes so much sense when you talk about it, putting it all together for us and then taking us through those maps. And that one map with the dotted lines where you talked about that there was the zone of influences. I mean, shockingly, that sort of recalled 1984. the novel, the kind of the dystopian novel, where you have like three groups that ally and work against each other. And then bringing it down to like what this could mean for you. I really appreciate this very much. I don't have a question. I have a lot of fear. Some of it, I mean, it looks like there's hope, but there's just a lot of scary stuff. And the idea of this horrible invasion putting the world in a situation where more nations ultimately are going to be seeking nuclear weapons is horrible. The fact that that's one of the consequences is absolutely terrifying and horrible. Thank you. I mean, thank you for just walking us through this so beautifully. Thank you.
Just to make it a little more depressing, one thing I don't have time to go into because it takes a while to explain, is that missile defense is not the answer. With the possibility, especially against ICBMs that would be used against the United States, anybody that studies this issue, and I have actually studied this issue quite a bit, my Ph.D. advisor I've mentioned a couple times, Dr. Krusel, was on the negotiating team that negotiated the ABM treaty, the first limit on missile defenses in 1972. We're not going to be building a missile defense that has any real effectiveness. And people always bring up the Israeli example. That actually proves that missile defense against missiles armed with nuclear weapons is still a pipe dream. And I can explain it, but it takes a while.
Thank you. Thank you. I can see there are questions from both Anara and perhaps also August. So Algun, go ahead and yield the microphone.
Me first? Okay. Thank you very much for fascinating report. I wish it should be published and people should know more about your vision. If you look at the experts, they discuss the possibility of war between Russia and certain European countries. Europe is divided and now Europe is weaker. And especially beginning with this year, and they consider the possible candidates: Finland, Sweden, Denmark, definitely Baltic states, and if America challenges Denmark openly, why Russia could not do this and actually mirror this? What do you think actually how situation changed drastically in this year? Thank you.
If the United States goes ahead with its threats on Greenland against Denmark, which I pray we don't do. You know, I get a little emotional about this, but 43 Danes died in Afghanistan because New York was attacked. That's second only in per capita terms. It's second only to the losses that the United States suffered. There is absolutely nothing we can gain by seizing Greenland that we can't gain because Denmark's a member of NATO. We've got a base, Thule Air Base. It's Piftuk now, I think is what it's called, has been there since 1953. And at times, we've had all kinds of bases in Greenland. The Danes have always said yes. We actually did something called Operation Iceworm in the 1950s, where we tunneled under the Greenland ice cap to see if we could deploy intermediate range ballistic missiles armed with nuclear weapons in Greenland. That's true. That's a true story. I hope we don't do that. But if we were to do that, then you're moving into a sphere of influence world. That's exactly what that means. And essentially, you are giving Russia and China a green light, China to move on Taiwan, Russia to perhaps move on the Baltics, which I agree, Anara, the Baltics are the next potential target. And also and you talked about this in your presentation, gosh, 6 months ago or so, that trying to connect Kaliningrad, that little area of Russia just north of Poland, with the rest of Russia, I think would be one of Putin's dreams. August, did you have a question?
Yes, I do.
August,
thank you. A very good overview, geopolitical overview. Remind me, what happened to SEATO?
SEATO, that was an attempt, and this happened in the Eisenhower administration in Dulles, to try to build to surround the Soviet Union with NATO-like organizations. And we had CETO, we had CENTO in Southwest Asia. None of them really got very far, really got off the ground. We talked about, needing to intervene in Vietnam because of our commitments to CETO. But in the end, none of those organizations ever achieved the kind of unity, the kind of integration, the kind of cooperation that NATO did. Part of the problem is that most of those countries were just emerging from European colonial domination and were still pretty divided themselves. They had their own. This is true throughout the area where Europeans colonized, that those borders were drawn to suit the European imperial power. And all of those countries had a great deal of trouble with borders that didn't match the political allegiance of the people. It wasn't as true in CETO. It was more true in CENTO. It was more true in the Middle East. But CETO never really emerged as a viable organization. And so it was forgotten pretty quickly.
I forgot about it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. As again, we're focusing more on Ukraine and Russia, very briefly, do you see the situation in which the current war, active fighting, ceases and freezes in whether Korean or, as General Kellergiven hinted, German scenario? And you mentioned possibilities, but what is realistic here? Do we have right now any estimate?
I still think Putin is determined to conquer Ukraine. I don't think he's given up on that. I think he's calculated that Trump wants to lift the sanctions, that Trump doesn't care about Ukraine. I think this is Putin. I think this is what's in Putin's head. I think this is why he overplayed his hand a little bit. I think he believes that he can continue this and Ukraine will eventually collapse. That the Europeans will be too slow and without American help, Ukraine can't survive. I hope he's wrong. I really pray he's wrong. And, until the United States lifts sanctions and pulls back and essentially sides with Putin, I'm going to hold out hope. I am not optimistic that the war is going to end soon. I think there's a possibility of a ceasefire, but I think in the end, the ceasefire will collapse. In the end, ceasefires happen and peace agreements come when at least one of the two sides comes to believe it's in their interests. Right now, it's clearly not in Ukraine's interest. If Russia wants to fight, Ukraine has to fight. And I think Putin is determined to fight. So I think the war is going to go on for a while. The best case scenario is if the United States stays engaged and we do not lift economic sanctions on Russia. And it does worry me that the leader of the Russian negotiations that Steve Witkoff has worked with apparently fairly well is the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. That actually worries me a little bit. Who knows? Kirill Dmitriev knows the United States very well and speaks fluent English. He studied at Harvard, and that worries me. But I'm fairly pessimistic that the war is going to end anytime soon. Maybe the United States gets frustrated and washes its hands of the negotiations. Then it depends on, do we lift sanctions? Do we continue to aid the Ukrainians at all? Like I said, we're in a state of flux right now. Right now, I'm not sure exactly how it's going to go.
Thank you. I think there's one more. Leslie, please.
I can't hear you, Leslie.
Leslie, you're muted.
Yep, nothing yet.
No, Leslie, you're not heard. Sorry.
I see what you typed in the chat. Were you going to ask something about that?
There is no connection.
Yeah. But I just going from what you said in the chat, yes, it is very interesting that these two Munich conferences were so important. And it was not lost on the Europeans that Vice President Vance's speech, which seemed to bolster the nationalist forces in Europe, the AfD and the nationalists in Romania and others, it was not lost on them that speech was made in Munich. And it wasn't just the speech in Munich, it was the fact that Vance met with the leaders of the AfD following the speech.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just a really
Yes,
general
Katerina,
question.
please.
So if for these speeches, both Pete Hegseth's speech and J.D. Vance's speech, like, are these speeches not vetted? Are they like do these leaders go sit down, write their own speech and deliver them? I mean, surely they consult or run it by someone, or to kind of like to get the impact of how it will be received. I mean, they may mean to say one thing, but I mean, surely they have a team there to say, oh wait, if you say this will be the reaction. This is likely the consequence. This is like, how does that work?
Under normal circumstances, and I don't know this particular situation. A lot of times these things come out in a book, 6 months, a year later. I don't know the situation here, but under normal circumstances, if the vice president or the secretary of defense, both of them going abroad for the first time in a new administration, if they were going to make a speech on a major or even a minor foreign policy domain, that speech would be thoroughly vetted through the National Security Council, that the NSC would go over every word of that speech with a fine-tooth comb, and every agency would weigh in on it, that you do not make policy pronouncements like this unless it is thoroughly vetted. Did those two speeches, which were so upsetting to the Europeans, did they go through the NSC process? I don't know. Should they have? Absolutely. You don't make major foreign policy pronouncements without a thorough vetting.
Yeah. Thank you. I was wondering about that. Thank you.
Okay, I see. You want me to answer Leslie's question here?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'd say it. A 30-second elevator speech to convince Americans that America first will strengthen Russia and China. Well, in a lot of ways, it's what I talk. If it's truly America first, if it's truly a retreat into that sphere of influence world, the United States is dramatically weaker. Dramatically weaker. One of the things which has made America so powerful in this Cold War and post-Cold War world is the system of alliances we built. I mean, you could make it, you could make the statement in Clausewitz's terms that it's the center of gravity of American power. I'll give you an example. Russia has one overseas military base, and it is actually not unoccupied right now because it was in Syria. China has one in the Horn of Africa. They are possibly going to get access to a base in Cambodia, maybe in Sri Lanka. We have 750. I showed you how China is ringed with American allies. There are American troops, American sailors, American airmen in every one of those places. 3rd Marine Division's in Okinawa. 2 Air Force Air Wings in Japan. American aircraft carrier home ported in Japan. I'm not sure. For a long time, it's 38,000 American troops in South Korea, 2nd Infantry Division. It is an enormous part of American power. If the United States were to retreat, we would be enormously weaker and unable to influence world events. And the power of the American economy is closely tied to that system of alliances. If we are no longer a military ally of countries like that, then you can easily get back into a world where everybody follows, from the 1920s, a beggar thy neighbor tariff policy, and we all try to wall each other off. And the history of that's not good. So I hope that America First doesn't mean that. But that's my elevator speech. Hopefully, it'd probably be a long elevator ride, but.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. McCollister. We'll probably stop here, and thank you for giving us this overview in these really unclear times when history textbooks are mostly outdated. History is written every day right now, and I hope we will stay here to report on it as it goes on and changes. Dr. Shrey, please give a greeting to our Ukraine viewers. I see at least some here.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!